"You clearly don't belong in first class." Serafina Blackwood's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. The orange juice had barely dried on her silk blouse when she turned toward Elijah Hayes with fury that could melt steel. Her designer heels clicked against the aircraft floor as she stood, towering over the quiet man in seat 2A. Elijah remained perfectly still. His weathered hand stayed folded over a dog-eared copy of Aviation Weekly. He didn't flinch when she pointed at the spreading stain. He didn't apologize when other passengers craned their necks to watch the drama unfold. Instead, he glanced briefly at the cabin's emergency equipment panel, then back at his magazine. "This is what happens," Serafina continued, her voice rising, "when airlines let just anyone buy premium seats. Look at this mess. My blouse costs more than most people make in a week." 5-year-old Chloe Hayes shrank deeper into her window seat, still clutching the empty plastic cup that had caused all this trouble. Her small voice whispered, "Sorry, Daddy." Emergency protocols existed for situations exactly like this, when civilian expertise became the difference between life and death. The flight to New York would take 90 minutes under normal circumstances, but as Elijah's trained eye had already noticed, the subtle vibration in the wing flaps suggested circumstances were about to become anything but normal. Right now, though, all anyone could hear was Serafina's righteous indignation and his daughter's quiet breathing beside him. Elijah Hayes had learned to ignore judgment years ago. The worn copy of Aviation Weekly in his lap told a story most people couldn't read. Dog-eared pages marked with technical notes, margin scribbles about hydraulic system improvements, repair schedules penciled in careful handwriting. His wedding ring caught the cabin light as he turned another page. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, but he still wore the simple gold band. Some habits died harder than others. "Daddy, is the angry lady going to make us move?" Chloe's whisper barely reached his ear. At 5 years old, she understood more about adult cruelty than any child should. Her small fingers traced patterns on the airplane window while she waited for his answer. "No, sweetheart, we belong here just as much as anyone else." His voice stayed steady, warm. The lie came easier these days, not about belonging, but about caring what people like Serafina thought. He'd given up caring about a lot of things when Sarah's cancer took her: career advancement, professional recognition, other people's opinions about his choices. The magazine's latest article caught his attention again: cost-cutting measures in modern aviation when safety meets economics. He'd lived through those decisions firsthand. They'd cost him his job at Meridian Aerospace when he'd refused to sign off on certain design modifications that saved the company millions but worried him enough to keep detailed notes in his home office. Why did successful people always assume struggle meant failure? "Look at her, calling me the smartest hero." Chloe giggled softly, pointing at a picture in his magazine. The image showed a small aircraft with its emergency systems highlighted in bright colors. To her, it looked like a superhero's gadget. To Elijah, it represented 15 years of specialized knowledge that most people would never understand or appreciate. "That's right, baby girl. Engineers are heroes too." He smoothed her dark hair so much like Sarah's. This trip to New York was supposed to be about Chloe seeing her grandparents, not about the remote consulting contract that barely paid their bills. Single parenthood had taught him to prioritize differently than his old colleagues who still chased corner offices and company cars. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother-in-law. "Flight tracking shows you're on time. Chloe's room is ready." Simple words that meant everything: support, family, the things that mattered more than first-class amenities or designer clothes. The aircraft's engines hummed at a frequency that made his engineer's ear twitch slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle variation in the normal rhythm that most passengers would never notice. He'd spent enough time around turbofan engines to recognize when something wasn't quite standard. The variation was minor enough that pilots might dismiss it as normal operational variance. But Elijah Hayes knew better than to dismiss small irregularities. Serafina was still dabbing at her blouse with airline napkins, muttering complaints loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Ruined, absolutely ruined. I have the most important meeting of my career waiting in New York, and now I look like I got dressed in the dark." Her phone rang. Serafina Blackwood. Her voice shifted to pure business mode. Yes, Marcus, I'm still on schedule. The Hartwell acquisition depends on this presentation. No, there can't be any delays. This deal is worth more than most companies see in 5 years. She paced the narrow aisle between first-class seats, her energy filling the small space. Everything about her screamed success. The way she commanded attention, the way she spoke in numbers and deadlines, the way she treated setbacks like personal insults from the universe. I've worked 18 months to get Hartwell Industries to the table. She continued into her phone. 18 months of perfect presentations, flawless proposals, and building exactly the right relationships. One afternoon in Manhattan, and I'll close the deal that makes my company a major player in the tech acquisition space. Elijah found himself listening despite his better judgment. Her passion was undeniable, even wrapped in arrogance. She'd built something important, achieved something meaningful, the kind of professional success he'd once imagined for himself before life taught him different lessons about what mattered. Still, success didn't excuse cruelty toward children or assumptions about strangers. As the plane climbed toward cruising altitude, none of the passengers could have guessed that their safe arrival would depend entirely on the man Serafina had just destroyed. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom with professional calm. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Collins. We're experiencing a minor mechanical issue with our flap control system. Nothing to be concerned about, but we'll need to run some diagnostic checks before our approach into LaGuardia. Elijah's hands tightened on his magazine. Flap control system. The words hit him like a physical blow. Not because they were dangerous, yet, but because he knew exactly what Captain Collins wasn't saying. Modern aircraft had multiple redundancies. Pilots didn't announce minor issues unless backup systems were also showing irregularities. Serafina barely looked up from her phone. How long will this delay us? I cannot be late for my meeting. A flight attendant with kind eyes and graying temples approached their section. His name tag read Mark. We're not expecting any significant delays, ma'am. Just standard precautionary measures. But Elijah caught something in Mark's tone. A careful neutrality that suggested the crew knew more than they were sharing. His engineering mind automatically began cataloging possibilities: hydraulic pressure loss, actuator malfunction, computer interface errors. Each scenario had different implications for landing procedures. The subtle engine frequency variation he'd noticed earlier suddenly made more sense. "Daddy, why did the captain sound worried?" Chloe's question cut through his technical analysis. Children had a gift for hearing what adults tried to hide. Sometimes pilots just want to make sure everything works perfectly, sweetheart. The half-truth felt necessary. No point frightening her over what might still be routine troubleshooting. But his engineer's instincts were screaming that routine problems didn't require passenger announcements. He found himself studying the cabin more carefully. Emergency exit locations, oxygen mask compartments, the crew's facial expressions as they moved through their safety checks. Mark caught his eye and nodded slightly. A recognition between professionals, perhaps. Serafina continued her phone conversation, oblivious to anything beyond her own schedule. Marcus, push back the Hartwell meeting if necessary, but only by 30 minutes. Any longer and we risk looking disorganized. The aircraft's movement felt different now. Subtle changes in the way they responded to air currents. Minor adjustments in engine thrust that suggested the pilots were compensating for something. Most passengers would attribute these sensations to normal turbulence. Elijah knew better. Captain Collins' voice returned, more subdued than before. "Flight attendants, please prepare for a crew consultation in the forward galley." Mark disappeared toward the cockpit with 2 other crew members. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but their body language spoke volumes. Crossed arms, serious expressions, frequent glances toward the passenger cabin. "This is ridiculous," Serafina announced to no one in particular. "How hard can it be to fix a simple mechanical problem? These airlines need better maintenance standards." Elijah almost laughed at the irony. Better maintenance standards. She had no idea how prophetic those words might be, or how many corners had been cut in the name of quarterly profit margins. He thought about the manila folder in his home office, documentation of every safety concern he'd raised during his final months at Meridian Aerospace. Concerns that had been dismissed as excessive caution and cost-prohibitive perfectionism. The crew consultation lasted longer than normal. When Mark finally returned to the cabin, his professional smile seemed forced. He began checking seatbelt compliance and tray table positions, unusual for mid-flight service, preparation for something that required secure seating. Attention passengers, this is Captain Collins again. Our maintenance team has identified the issue as more complex than initially assessed. We're consulting with ground control and manufacturer representatives to ensure we follow proper procedures. The euphemisms were getting thicker. More complex than initially assessed meant multiple systems were involved. Consulting with manufacturer representatives meant the problem was serious enough to require expert input. Elijah's stomach nodded with recognition. Serafina finally looked up from her phone. What does that mean exactly? It means they're being thorough, Mark replied, but his eyes found Elijah's face. Something passed between them, a moment of understanding that this wasn't routine anymore. Daddy, are we okay? Chloe's small hand slipped into his. We're fine, baby girl. The pilots know what they're doing. Another necessary half-truth. The pilots were competent, but competence had limits when aircraft systems started failing in unexpected ways. He squeezed her hand gently, hoping his calm demeanor would reassure her. But inside, Elijah Hayes was running through every worst-case scenario he'd studied during 15 years of aviation systems engineering, and he didn't like where his expertise was leading him. As Elijah listened to the captain's increasingly desperate consultations, he realized that his silence might cost 200 lives, including his daughter's. Elijah rose from his seat with quiet determination. The manila envelope of technical documentation in his carry-on bag suddenly felt heavier than lead, but his daughter's safety outweighed any personal humiliation. He approached Mark near the galley, where the flight attendant was reviewing emergency procedure cards with unusual intensity. "Excuse me," Elijah said softly. "I need to speak with you about the flap control issue." Mark looked up, his professional mask slipping for just a moment. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but—" "My name is Elijah Hayes. I used to work for Meridian Aerospace as Director of Aviation Systems Engineering." The words felt strange after 3 years of remote consulting work. "I helped design the backup protocols for the exact system that's failing right now." Mark's eyes widened with sudden recognition. "Hayes, Elijah Hayes. You wrote the technical bulletin about hydraulic actuator redundancy failures. I remember your name from our crew briefings 2 years ago." The connection sparked like electricity. Mark had been flying long enough to remember when Elijah's safety recommendations had been circulated throughout the industry, before budget cuts and corporate politics had buried most of them. That bulletin was about this aircraft model, wasn't it? Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. Elijah nodded grimly. Finally, someone who understood what they were really facing. "Show me what you know," Mark said, leading Elijah to a quieter section of the galley. Elijah pulled out his aviation magazine and began sketching on the back cover. His pen moved with practiced precision, drawing system diagrams that most people would need computer software to create. Primary hydraulic lines, secondary backup circuits, emergency manual override pathways. "The problem isn't just mechanical failure," Elijah explained quietly. "It's a cascade effect. When the primary flap actuators lose hydraulic pressure, the backup system tries to compensate. But there's a design flaw in the pressure regulation valve that causes overcorrection." Mark studied the diagram with growing alarm. "Which leads to complete loss of flap control during landing approach. The aircraft becomes essentially unflyable at low speeds." Elijah's pen traced the failure pathway. "I documented this exact scenario in my final report at Meridian, recommended immediate modification of the pressure valve assembly." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "What happened to your recommendation?" "The modification would have cost $47 million across their entire fleet. The company decided the statistical probability of failure was acceptably low." Elijah's voice carried 3 years of bitter vindication. "They chose shareholder profits over passenger safety. I have the original documentation," Elijah continued, pulling out his phone. "Photos of every technical memo, every safety analysis, every ignored warning I submitted before I left the company." Mark scrolled through image after image of technical reports, stamped with "budget review required" and "cost prohibitive," email chains showing Elijah's increasingly urgent warnings being dismissed by executives who understood spreadsheets better than aircraft systems. This is exactly what's happening up there, isn't it? Mark's voice was barely audible. The pilots are probably seeing intermittent flap response right now. Sometimes the system works, sometimes it doesn't. They're hoping it's a minor glitch that will resolve itself. Elijah's engineering mind was already running worst-case calculations. But I know this failure pattern. It only gets worse, never better. The final email in the sequence was Elijah's resignation letter, 3 paragraphs explaining that he couldn't be part of an organization that willingly ignored safety risks to protect quarterly earnings. They said I was being unnecessarily alarmist. He added, with dark irony, "Turns out I wasn't alarmist enough." Mark's hands were shaking as he handed back the phone. "I need to get you to the captain immediately," Mark said, his training overriding his shock. "Emergency protocols allow us to utilize any qualified expertise available during in-flight emergencies." The words Elijah had been hoping to hear. Aviation law was clear about civilian expert consultation during crisis situations. Captain Collins had the authority to bring anyone into the cockpit if their knowledge could save lives. What about her? Mark glanced toward Serafina, who was still absorbed in her phone calls and blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. "She doesn't need to know yet," Elijah replied, "but she's going to find out soon enough that the man she humiliated might be the only reason she makes it to her precious meeting alive." Mark was already moving toward the cockpit door, his professional urgency overriding normal passenger protocols. Emergency situations created their own rules. "Sir," Mark paused at the cockpit entrance, "are you absolutely certain about this failure analysis?" Elijah thought about his daughter sleeping peacefully in seat 2A, about Sarah's memory and the promise he'd made to always put Chloe first, about 3 years of wondering if his safety warnings had been paranoid overcaution or prophetic engineering wisdom. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The cockpit door opened with a quiet click that sounded like destiny. As Elijah walked toward the cockpit, Serafina's shocked expression was the least of his concerns. The plane was dying, and only he knew how to save it. The cockpit was smaller than most people imagined, filled with screens displaying warnings in angry red text. Captain Collins looked up as Mark entered with Elijah, his weathered face showing the strain of managing multiple system failures simultaneously. "Captain, this is Elijah Hayes, former Director of Aviation Systems at Meridian Aerospace," Mark announced quickly. "He has specific knowledge about our current malfunction." Elijah's eyes swept across the instrument panels, reading the cascade of error messages like a grim technical novel. Hydraulic pressure warnings, actuator response delays, computer diagnostic failures. It was worse than he'd feared. Much worse. "Mr. Hayes," Captain Collins said tersely, "what can you tell me that my maintenance manual can't?" "Your flap actuators aren't just malfunctioning," Elijah replied, pointing to specific readouts. "They're in cascade failure mode. Every time the backup system tries to compensate, it creates more pressure imbalances. Either the problem will compound exponentially until you lose all control authority during approach." The co-pilot, Lieutenant Martinez, looked up from his emergency checklist. "How long do we have?" Elijah studied the hydraulic pressure graphs trending downward on the monitors. "Based on these degradation patterns, maybe 40 minutes before complete system failure." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. "There's only one solution," Elijah continued, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was suggesting. "Manual override of the entire flap control system. Someone needs to physically access the hydraulic bay and operate the backup actuators by hand during landing approach." Captain Collins stared at him. "That's impossible. The hydraulic bay is inaccessible during flight, and manual operation requires precise timing with landing procedures." "Not impossible. Dangerous?" Elijah pulled up technical schematics on his phone, showing access pathways most pilots never knew existed. "There's a maintenance crawlway behind the passenger cabin. During my time at Meridian, I supervised emergency repairs that required exactly this type of manual intervention." Lieutenant Martinez was already consulting his emergency manual. "Sir, I don't see any procedures for passenger cabin access to hydraulic systems, because airlines don't want passengers to know those access points exist," Elijah explained. "Insurance liability issues, but in genuine emergencies, those crawlways can save lives." The captain's radio crackled with updates from ground control, but Elijah could see in his eyes that traditional solutions weren't going to work. They were running out of both time and options. "How do you know this will work?" Captain Collins asked. "Because I helped design these exact emergency procedures 12 years ago." Through the cockpit door, Elijah could see passengers beginning to notice unusual crew activity. Flight attendants were discreetly securing loose items and reviewing emergency positions, the subtle signs of preparation that preceded serious trouble. Serafina was finally looking up from her phone, her business conversation interrupted by the increasingly obvious tension throughout the cabin. She caught sight of Elijah standing in the cockpit doorway, and her expression shifted from confusion to outright shock. "What is he doing up there?" she demanded loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Mark approached her with diplomatic professionalism. "Ma'am, Mr. Hayes is providing technical consultation to the flight crew." "Technical consultation? From him?" Serafina's voice carried across first class. "That man can't even keep his child from spilling juice. What possible expertise could he offer?" Other passengers were starting to pay attention now. The social dynamics that had seemed so important an hour ago suddenly felt petty and irrelevant against the backdrop of genuine crisis. "Ma'am," Mark said more firmly, "Mr. Hayes is a former aviation systems engineer with specific knowledge of our current mechanical issue." The words hit Serafina like a physical blow. Former aviation systems engineer. The quiet man she'd humiliated was exactly the kind of expert they needed. Captain Collins' voice came over the intercom with carefully measured calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a more complex mechanical issue than initially reported. Our estimated arrival time will be delayed while we work with technical experts to ensure a safe landing." The fuel gauge showed reserves dropping toward minimum safe levels. They had perhaps 50 minutes of flying time remaining, but manual repair procedures would require at least 20 minutes of that precious window. "Ground control is suggesting we divert to Philadelphia," Lieutenant Martinez reported. "Longer runway, better emergency response capabilities." "No," Elijah said firmly. "Diversion will eat up fuel we can't spare. The manual repair has to happen during our approach to LaGuardia, or we won't have enough fuel for a second attempt anywhere." Captain Collins absorbed this information with the grim professionalism of a man who'd spent 30 years making life or death decisions. "You're telling me we have one chance to get this right?" "One chance," Elijah confirmed, "but it's a good chance if we execute properly." Through the cockpit window, Manhattan's skyline was already visible in the distance, their destination growing closer with each passing minute. "What do you need from us, Mr. Hayes?" The question he'd been waiting to hear. The moment when years of overlooked expertise finally mattered more than corporate politics or social prejudices. With less than an hour of fuel remaining and passengers unaware they were minutes from catastrophe, Elijah prepared to risk everything on a repair no one else could even attempt. Elijah squeezed through the narrow maintenance access panel behind the last row of seats, his body contorting into spaces designed for emergency repairs, not human comfort. The hydraulic bay hummed with mechanical energy, pumps straining against failing pressure regulators, backup systems cycling frantically as they fought to maintain control. His hands found the manual override levers exactly where the technical specifications promised they would be. 3 separate actuator controls that could substitute for the computerized system, but only if operated with split-second timing during landing approach. "Testing manual control now," he radioed to the cockpit through Mark's headset. The first lever moved smoothly. Hydraulic fluid flowed through backup channels, and for a moment, hope flickered through the aircraft systems. Then the pressure gauge spiked dangerously high. Overcorrection, just as his technical analysis had predicted. "Easy, easy," Elijah murmured to himself, adjusting the flow with the delicate touch of 15 years' experience. "Find the balance point." The system responded. Flap control stabilized. For 30 precious seconds, everything worked exactly as designed. Then the secondary pump began cavitating, and new warning lights cascaded across every monitor in the cockpit. "We're losing secondary hydraulic pressure," Lieutenant Martinez's voice crackled through the comm system. "The backup system is fighting against your manual inputs." Elijah could feel it through the control levers, mechanical resistance that shouldn't exist. The aircraft's computerized systems were interpreting his manual intervention as system malfunction, triggering automatic safety protocols that made everything worse. "I need to disconnect the computer override entirely," he called back. "Full manual control for landing approach." Captain Collins' voice carried new tension. That means no automated assistance for speed, altitude, or flap positioning. Everything becomes pilot skill and your manual timing. It's our only option. The computer systems are designed to prevent exactly what we need to do. Through the thin aluminum wall, Elijah could hear passengers beginning to murmur with growing concern. Flight attendants were moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking seatbelts and preparing for what they euphemistically called an abundance of caution. But Elijah knew the truth. They were preparing for a landing that would either be miraculous or catastrophic. There was no middle ground. His daughter's voice drifted back from first class. "Daddy, where did you go?" The sound nearly broke his concentration. In the passenger cabin, Serafina sat frozen in her seat as the reality of their situation finally penetrated her business-focused mindset. The man she'd publicly humiliated was currently risking his life in a maintenance bay to save everyone aboard, including her. "This can't be happening," she whispered to Mark as he passed her row. "I mean, surely there are other qualified people who can handle this situation." Mark paused, his professional composure cracking slightly. "Ma'am, Mr. Hayes is literally the only person on this aircraft who has the knowledge to attempt this repair. Without him, we would be declaring an emergency and hoping for the best." The words hit Serafina like ice water. The only person, the quiet father she'd dismissed as a failure, was their sole hope for survival. Around her, other passengers were beginning to understand the severity of their situation. Whispered conversations, nervous glances toward the cockpit, the subtle behavioral changes that preceded genuine panic. "I need to call my office," Serafina said automatically, reaching for her phone. "Ma'am, all electronic devices need to be turned off and secured," Mark replied gently. "We're beginning emergency landing preparations." For the first time in years, Serafina Blackwood was completely powerless to control her circumstances, and the person who held all the power was someone she had treated as worthless. "Chloe, sweetheart, Daddy is helping the pilots fix the airplane," Mark explained to the 5-year-old who was growing increasingly anxious about her father's absence. "Is Daddy in trouble?" she asked with the intuitive wisdom that children possessed about adult situations. "No, honey. Daddy is being very brave and very smart. He's helping make sure we land safely." Through the aircraft's internal communication system, Chloe could hear fragments of technical conversation between her father and the flight crew. Words she didn't understand, but tones that sounded serious and important. "That's my daddy," she announced proudly to no one in particular. "He's the smartest person in the whole world." Serafina heard this declaration from 3 seats away, the innocent faith of a child who understood her father's worth even when successful adults couldn't see it. The irony was devastating. Her phone rang with an incoming call from the Hartwell Industries acquisition team, the meeting that had seemed like the most important thing in the world 40 minutes ago. She looked at the screen for a long moment, then turned the device off without answering. Some things were more important than business deals. Some people were more important than she had realized. As Elijah fought to keep 200 people alive, Serafina finally understood the true cost of her cruelty, and it was more than she could bear. The hydraulic bay erupted in mechanical chaos as Elijah's worst fears materialized simultaneously. Primary pump failure, secondary system overload, emergency backup circuits sparking with electrical faults that cascaded through every control system like digital wildfire. "All automated flight controls are now offline," Captain Collins announced over the intercom with the kind of professional calm that masked absolute terror. "We are switching to full manual flight operation for our approach and landing." The manual override levers in Elijah's hands became the aircraft's central nervous system. Every adjustment he made would directly control whether they lived or died. No computer assistance, no safety nets, just human judgment against the laws of physics. "Mr. Hayes, we're beginning our descent now." Lieutenant Martinez's voice crackled through the comm. "Can you maintain flap control throughout the approach sequence?" Elijah felt the aircraft tilting into its descent pattern. Through the thin aluminum walls, he could sense passengers' growing awareness that this was no longer routine. Flight attendants were securing everything that could become a projectile. The energy in the cabin had shifted from concern to barely controlled fear. "I can maintain control," he radioed back, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. but I need constant communication about airspeed and altitude. My timing has to be perfect. One mistake would turn their controlled descent into an uncontrolled crash. I can't do this, Elijah whispered to himself as the magnitude of responsibility overwhelmed him. Through the aircraft's structure, he could hear his daughter asking flight attendants where her daddy had gone. Could hear the fear in her 5-year-old voice as she sensed the adults around her were scared. If he failed, Chloe would die because her father wasn't skilled enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough to save the people who depended on him. The same feelings of inadequacy that had haunted him since Sarah's death crashed over him like a wave. Maybe Serafina had been right about him. Maybe he was just a failure who couldn't handle real responsibility when it mattered most. Mr. Hayes? Captain Collins' voice cut through his spiral of self-doubt. We need your status report, the moment of choice. Retreat into safe self-preservation or risk everything for strangers who would never thank him. Risk his daughter's life on his own judgment when safer options still existed. Requesting permission to attempt emergency landing at Teterboro, Lieutenant Martinez suggested. Shorter approach, less complex manual requirements. No, Elijah said firmly, his father's instincts overriding his fear. Teterboro's runway isn't long enough if we overshoot. LaGuardia, or we don't make it at all. He was choosing the hardest possible option because it gave everyone else the best chance of survival. Beat 3. In the passenger cabin, Serafina's carefully constructed world was disintegrating piece by piece. The meeting that had defined her self-worth was now meaningless. The success that had justified her cruelty felt hollow and pathetic against the backdrop of genuine heroism happening in the aircraft's belly. I'm also a single mother, she found herself admitting to Mark as he checked her seatbelt for the 3rd time. The words came out before she could stop them, a confession she'd never made to a stranger before. Ma'am, I chose to have my daughter alone. Planned it that way. I thought being a single mother was about power and control, about proving I could do everything myself. Her voice cracked slightly. I never understood that it could be about sacrifice, about putting someone else's needs before your own success. Through the thin aircraft walls, she could hear Elijah's radio communications with the flight crew. Technical language about pressure differentials and actuator timing that revealed depths of expertise she'd been too arrogant to recognize. He gave up his career for his daughter, didn't he? She asked quietly. Mark nodded. Lost his job trying to prevent exactly this kind of system failure. Couldn't find comparable work because he'd been labeled a troublemaker. Chose family consulting over career advancement. Every cruel assumption she'd made about Elijah was crashing down around her like debris. The quiet dignity she'd mistaken for weakness. The sacrifice she'd dismissed as failure. The expertise she'd been too prejudiced to see. I destroyed a good man's morning because of a stained blouse, she whispered. The words tasted like ashes. Emergency landing in 15 minutes, Captain Collins announced to the cabin. Flight attendants, prepare for brace positions. Passengers, please review emergency procedures in your seatback cards. The final countdown had begun. Everything that could be secured was secured. Everything that could be checked was checked. Now they had to trust that one man's knowledge and skill could substitute for millions of dollars of computerized flight control systems. Elijah's hands ached from maintaining constant pressure on the manual controls. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cool air circulation. Through the aircraft's structure, he could feel every air current, every slight change in engine thrust, every adjustment the pilots made as they lined up for final approach. Daddy? Chloe's voice came through the thin wall separating him from the passenger cabin. Are you okay? The question pierced through his technical concentration like an arrow. His daughter was scared, and he couldn't comfort her, couldn't hold her hand or tell her everything would be fine. All he could do was use 15 years of engineering knowledge to keep her alive. I'm okay, sweetheart. He called back, hoping his voice carried through the aircraft's structure. Daddy's going to make sure we land safely. The promise felt like both the most important words he'd ever spoken and the most terrifying commitment he'd ever made. Beginning final approach, Captain Collins announced. Mr. Hayes, this is it. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd become as a father and an engineer. It all came down to the next 10 minutes. With 10 minutes of fuel left and the ground rushing toward them, Elijah made peace with the fact that saving everyone might cost him everything. Flaps to approach position now. Captain Collins' voice cut through the cockpit tension like a blade. Elijah's hands moved with surgical precision on the manual override controls, feeling the aircraft's flaps extend through pure mechanical feedback. No computer confirmation, no automated assistance, just the vibration of hydraulic actuators responding to his direct commands. The aircraft shuddered as LaGuardia's runway appeared below them, a narrow strip of concrete that suddenly looked impossibly small. Crosswinds pushed against the fuselage while Elijah fought to maintain flap angle against aerodynamic forces that wanted to tear the control surfaces away. Airspeed dropping through approach threshold, Lieutenant Martinez called out, "We need more flap extension." Elijah's muscles screamed as he adjusted the manual controls. Every degree of flap movement required physical strength that his arms were running out of. Through the aircraft's structure, he could feel passengers bracing for impact, their collective fear adding weight to his already crushing responsibility. "Hydraulic pressure fluctuating," he reported through gritted teeth. "I'm losing fine control authority." The manual levers were becoming sluggish. 15 years of engineering experience told him they had maybe 60 seconds before the backup hydraulic system failed completely. 60 seconds to save everyone he'd ever cared about. "Daddy's helping the pilots land our airplane." Chloe's voice suddenly echoed through the aircraft's internal communication system. Somehow, in the controlled chaos of emergency procedures, her innocent words had been picked up by an open microphone in the passenger cabin. "He's the smartest hero in the whole world." The declaration rang through every speaker in the aircraft, cockpit, passenger cabin, crew stations. Her pure faith in her father's abilities reached every ear aboard the aircraft, including Elijah's, as he fought against failing hydraulic systems in the mechanical crawl space. For a moment, everything became crystal clear. The technical complexity, the physical exhaustion, the fear of failure, none of it mattered compared to the trust in his daughter's voice. "That's right, baby girl," he whispered to himself, finding reserves of strength he hadn't known existed. "Daddy's going to bring us home." His hands steadied on the controls. The flap actuators responded with renewed precision. 15 years of overlooked expertise flowed through his fingers like muscle memory, turning mechanical systems into extensions of his will. Through the passenger cabin speakers, he could hear Serafina's quiet sob of recognition, finally understanding exactly who she had tried to destroy. "Landing gear down and locked," Captain Collins announced. "Final approach, full manual control. Mr. Hayes, we need maximum flap extension for touchdown." This was it, the moment when everything either worked perfectly or failed catastrophically. Elijah pulled the manual override levers to their maximum extension, feeling the aircraft's aerodynamics change as the flaps deployed fully. The runway rushed up toward them at terrifying speed. No room for error, no second chances. Either his calculations were perfect or they were all going to die together. 50 feet, Lieutenant Martinez called out. 40, 30. The aircraft touched down with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the fuselage. Elijah maintained pressure on the flap controls as the pilots applied maximum braking, feeling the manual hydraulic system fighting against massive aerodynamic loads. "We're down," Captain Collins' voice carried pure relief. "All passengers remain seated. Emergency crews are standing by, but we have successfully landed." The roar of reversed engines, the screech of brakes on concrete, the most beautiful sounds Elijah had ever heard. They were alive, all of them. Everyone was going home. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Collins." The announcement echoed through the cabin as emergency vehicles surrounded their aircraft. "I want to personally thank Mr. Elijah Hayes, who provided expert technical assistance that made our safe landing possible. His knowledge and courage saved every life aboard this aircraft." The words rang through the passenger cabin like vindication itself. Scattered applause began, growing into a thunderous ovation that shook the aircraft's walls. 200 people expressing gratitude to a man they'd never noticed before today. Elijah crawled out of the maintenance bay, his clothes soaked with sweat and hydraulic fluid, his hands cramped from maintaining pressure on manual controls. Mark was waiting with a towel and a smile that said more than words ever could. "Sir," Mark said formally, "on behalf of the crew and every passenger aboard, thank you." Through the cabin windows, Elijah could see Chloe pressed against the glass, her face radiant with pride and relief. She was safe. Everyone was safe. The promise he'd made to Sarah's memory, to always put their daughter first, had been kept in the most dramatic way imaginable. as passengers filed past him toward the emergency exits, many stopping to shake his hand or simply say, "Thank you." Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. His choices had been validated. His expertise had mattered. His sacrifice had saved lives. As 200 passengers erupted in grateful applause, Elijah finally looked at Serafina and saw something he'd never expected to see in her eyes. Serafina approached Elijah near the emergency exit, her designer composure completely stripped away by the magnitude of what had just happened. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expensive suit wrinkled, her perfectly styled hair disheveled from the stress of believing she was about to die because of her own cruelty. "Mr. Hayes," she began, then stopped, her voice catching on words she'd never had to say before. I need to apologize. What I said to you earlier, how I treated you and your daughter. There's no excuse for that behavior." Elijah paused in gathering his carry-on bag, studying her face for signs of manipulation or social positioning. But all he saw was genuine remorse and the kind of vulnerability that only came from staring mortality in the face. "I was wrong about everything," she continued quietly. "About you, about what matters, about what makes someone valuable. You saved my life after I tried to destroy your dignity. I don't know how to live with that." Her phone rang suddenly, the Hartwell Industries ringtone that had seemed so important just hours before. She glanced at the screen, then deliberately declined the call without answering. "Some things are more important than business," she said, more to herself than to him. The gesture spoke louder than any apology. "Thank you for saying that," Elijah replied gently. "But you don't need to carry guilt about this. We all make mistakes when we're under pressure." His kindness seemed to hit her harder than anger would have. Serafina's breath caught as she realized he was offering her grace she didn't deserve, the same grace she denied him when a simple accident had triggered her fury. "How can you be so generous after what I put you through?" "Because my daughter was watching," Elijah said simply. "I want her to learn that people can grow, can change, can become better than their worst moments. Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what kind of person I choose to be." Her phone rang again. This time, the screen showed multiple missed calls from her assistant, her business partners, urgent messages about the Hartwell acquisition. The business empire that had defined her entire identity was crumbling in real time while she stood in an airplane aisle, learning what actual strength looked like. "Miss Blackwood," her assistant's text message read, "Hartwell Industries has withdrawn from negotiations. They've decided to partner with your competitor instead. The deal is dead." The words should have devastated her. 6 months ago, they would have sent her into a spiral of professional panic and personal recrimination. Instead, she felt oddly relieved. "I lost my biggest business deal while we were in the air," Serafina said with a bitter laugh. "The meeting I was so desperate to reach, the contract I thought would define my career, it's gone." Elijah watched her process this professional catastrophe with surprising calm. "I'm sorry. I know that must be difficult." "The strange thing is, I'm not devastated," she admitted. "I should be furious, heartbroken, planning my revenge against the competition. But all I can think about is how trivial it seems compared to what just happened here." She looked toward the front of the plane where Chloe was waiting patiently for her father, her small hands pressed against the window as she watched emergency vehicles outside. "I have a daughter too," Serafina said quietly. "Emma. She's 7. I've been so focused on building an empire to leave her that I forgot to actually spend time with her, forgot to show her what kind of person I want her to become." The admission came from somewhere deep and honest, a place she rarely let anyone see. "It's not too late to change that," Elijah offered. "Kids are remarkably forgiving when parents make genuine efforts to do better." His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom about what actually mattered in life. As passengers continued filing off the aircraft, Chloe finally reached her father with the boundless energy of a child who'd been separated from her parent during scary circumstances. "Daddy, everyone's saying you're a hero. You saved the airplane." Elijah scooped her into his arms, feeling her small body relax against his chest. This was what success actually looked like. Not corporate recognition or professional advancement, but the simple certainty that he'd kept his promise to always put her safety first. "I just helped the pilots do their job, sweetheart. That's what people do for each other when it matters. Like how you helped the mean lady even after she was rude to us." The innocent observation hit both adults like a lightning bolt. Children saw moral complexity with devastating clarity. "Yes, baby girl, exactly like that." Serafina watched this exchange with something approaching wonder, the quiet dignity she'd mistaken for weakness, the strength she'd been too blind to recognize, the kind of character that couldn't be bought or achieved through professional success. As they walked toward the terminal, Elijah's phone buzzed with 17 missed calls from aviation companies who'd already heard about his heroic repair work. Job offers, consulting opportunities, the career recognition that had eluded him for 3 years was suddenly flooding back. But all he noticed was his daughter's hand in his, and the peaceful certainty that he'd chosen correctly all along. Sometimes the people we overlook are exactly the ones we need most. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales of hidden heroes and unexpected justice. Elijah sat beside his sleeping daughter on the airport shuttle, her small hand holding his wedding ring as she dreamed, while his phone showed 17 missed calls from aviation companies wanting to hire him. But all he saw was her peaceful face, knowing he chose correctly all along.